In 1989, a 13-year-old boy went missing from his own home in East Point, Georgia. His mother was sure he was a victim. His stepfather and the police said he was a kid who bailed. For 6 years, the lie was the only story. Then, one stormy night, a blown pipe in the garage forced his mother to confront a wall her husband had built and the horrifying, unthinkable secret it had been hiding. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments where you watching from and what time is it there. It really means a lot to know you're here with us. We're in this together. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The house on Maple Drive was a ticking time bomb, and on that sticky Friday night in the autumn of 1989, it was about to explode. The air inside was heavy with silent tension, a tension that had been building for the 2 years since Hank Porter had married Loretta Grant and moved into the home she had once shared with her late husband and her son, Trey. Trey, or TJ as his friends called him, was 13. He was a good kid, but he was also a ball of raw adolescent energy. His world was defined by the scratch of a DJ's record, the hiss of a spray paint can, and a loud, raw beat of early hip-hop. His bedroom walls were a collage of posters. Run DMC, Public Enemy, Big Daddy Kane. He spent his afternoons in the garage, a large detached building behind the house, with a worn piece of cardboard spread on the concrete floor, practicing his breakdancing moves to the thunderous beat from his boombox. To Hank Porter, this wasn't just noise. It was an act of defiance. Hank was a man of uptight, tight grip on everything. A skilled carpenter in his early 40s. He was sure in straight lines, low-key evenings, and full command. He had married Loretta, a loving but weary woman still grieving the loss of her first husband, with the promise of providing a stable 2-parent home. But his vision of stability was one of control-freak style. He saw TJ's loud culture not as a form of expression, but as a direct challenge to his authority, an out-of-control intrusion into the low-key, orderly world he was trying to build. And beneath his front of firm but fair fatherhood, there was a low-key bias, a resentment for the energetic black teenager who was a constant reminder that this home, this family, had a history that did not include him. The argument started, as it often did, over the music. TJ had his boombox cranked up in the garage, the bass line of a new EPMD track vibrating through the floorboards of the main house. Hank, who had been trying to read the paper in his armchair, stormed out the back door. "Turn that garbage off," he shouted over the music, his face a mask of fury. TJ, caught mid-spin, killed the music. "It's not garbage," he snapped, his voice dripping with teenage defiance. "It's music, it's noise, it's filth," Hank spat, his eyes scanning the garage with disgust. He saw the empty spray paint cans TJ used for his art projects on large pieces of plywood. "And this is a disaster. I told you to clean this place up. It's my space," TJ said, gesturing around the garage. "My dad built this space for me." It was the wrong thing to say. The mention of Anessa's late husband always ignited a special kind of fury in Hank. "This is my house now," Hank said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing snarl. "And that means it's my garage, and you respect my rules." The confrontation escalated quickly. Loretta, hearing the raised voices, came out to the porch, her face etched with a familiar weariness. "Hank, please," she said. "He's just a boy. He's a disrespectful punk," Hank snarled, not taking his eyes off TJ, "and he's about to learn a lesson." He grabbed the boombox. "If you can't be responsible, you don't deserve this." "Hey, get your hands off my stuff," TJ shouted, lunging forward. Hank shoved it back hard. TJ stumbled, catching his balance, his face a mixture of shock and rage. "You can't do that. I can do whatever I want in my own house," Hank roared. He turned to Loretta. Your son needs discipline, real discipline, not just you coddling him every time he acts out." He pointed a thick finger at TJ. You stay out here. You're going to clean this entire garage, top to bottom, and you're going to sit here and think about what you've done. I don't want to see your face in my house again tonight." With that, he slammed the side door of the garage shut, leaving TJ in the half-dark room. The single bare bulb overhead, casting long, distorted shadows. Loretta, seeing the look on Hank's face, a look of stone-cold look of victory, felt a shiver of panic, but she was too exhausted to fight him. She retreated back into the house, hoping TJ would cool off and the crazy storm would pass, as always did, but this time, the crazy storm was different. The fight wasn't over. Hank, his rage not satisfied, went back into the garage. The argument with TJ reignited. This time, without Loretta as a buffer, it became physical. In a moment of ultimate monstrous control, Hank, a man much larger and stronger than the 13-year-old, overpowered him, perhaps using a chemical-soaked rag to subdue him. He then dragged the unconscious boy to the back of the garage, to the new thick wall he had recently finished. Behind it was a small, dark, soundproofed room he had secretly built over the past year, a hidden cell for his tools. He had told Loretta it was a lie. It was a locked-up space waiting for its occupant. He placed TJ inside, chained his ankle to a bolt he had sunk into the concrete floor, and sealed the hidden entrance. His stepson had now been properly disciplined. He had been permanently removed from Hank's perfect, orderly world. An hour passed, then 2. Loretta, assuming TJ was still sulking, left him alone. But when she finally went to the garage to check on him before bed, he was gone. The boombox was on the floor, its plastic casing cracked. A few of his spray paint cans were tipped over, but TJ was nowhere to be seen. She wasn't worried, not at first. He had run off to a friend's house before after big arguments, always returning the next morning with a sheepish apology. Hank, when she told him, just grunted. Good. Let him learn what the real world is like. He'll come crawling back when he gets hungry. But TJ didn't come back the next morning. He didn't come back that night. A week later, after frantic calls to all his friends and family had yielded nothing, after a profound and terrifying silence had settled over their lives, Loretta Grant finally officially reported her 13-year-old son missing. The last argument was over. The long, silent nightmare had just begun. The police investigation into the vanishing of Trey T.J. Grant began not with a sense of urgency, but with a weary, bureaucratic sigh. When Loretta Grant, her eyes reddened and her face etched with a week of sleepless terror, sat in the sterile interview room of the local precinct, she was met with a practiced, placating calm that felt more dismissive than reassuring. Her husband, Hank Porter, sat beside her, playing the role of the concerned, heartbroken stepfather to perfection. He was the one who did most of the talking, his voice a mask of sorrowful resignation. He recounted the argument on that Friday night, framing it not as a confrontation driven by his own rage, but as the culmination of TJ's escalating rebellious behavior. He was a good kid deep down, Hank told the detectives, shaking his head sadly. But he was falling in with a bad crowd. The music, the graffiti, he was angry at me, at the world. I tried to be a father to him, to give him the discipline he needed, but he wouldn't listen. For the 2 white detectives assigned to the case, men already inclined to view the struggles of a blended black family through a prism of cynical stereotypes, Hank's story was a convenient gift. It was a neat, simple narrative that required minimal effort and confirmed their own biases. A rebellious black teen from a broken home as they saw it clashing with a new stepfather and running away. "We see this a lot, Mrs. Davis," the lead detective said to Loretta, his tone dripping with condescension. A new man comes into the house. The boy feels like his territory is being threatened. It's a classic power struggle. He's not missing. He's making a statement. He'll be back when his money runs out, or when he gets tired of being on the streets. Loretta's protests, her desperate insistence that TJ would never do this, that he would never leave her, were brushed aside as a mother's understandable but naive denial. She tried to explain his love for his home, his art, the very garage he'd went missing from. They simply nodded, their expressions unchanged. The final nail in the coffin of the investigation came 2 days later. Hank called the precinct, his voice heavy with emotion. "I found it," he said. "I found a scrap note." He produced a crumpled piece of notebook paper for the detectives. "I found this in his room, tucked inside a book." The scrap note, written in a scrolled approximation of a teenager's handwriting, was a vicious, calculated lie. It spoke of feeling trapped, of hating his reset, of running away to a big city where he could be free. It ended with a defiant, "Don't come looking for me." When Loretta saw the scrap note, her heart broke, but a seed of deep intuitive doubt was planted. In her heart, she knew that jerky, angry scroll was not her son's. TJ's handwriting was like his art, full of flair, of loops, and sharp angles. The scrap note was crude, simple, but her grief was a confusing fog, and these were men of authority holding what they called proof. Her doubts were silenced by their certainty. The investigation was over almost before it began. With the kid who bailed scrap note as a convenient conclusion, police filed a standard report, which was circulated with a lack of urgency that was insulting. There was no widespread search, no media blitz. The case of Trey DeGrant was closed, his vanishing filed away not as a potential twisted act, but as the predictable act of a troubled teen. Hank, the concerned stepfather, had given them the perfect story, and they had eagerly accepted it. The 6 years that followed the vanishing of her son were a study in the slow, corrosive power of unresolved grief. For Loretta Grant, life became a low-key gray landscape, the loud colors of her world having been bleached out on that autumn night in 1989. She lived with a man she loved, her husband Hank, yet their home was haunted by the shell of a person of her son and the deafening silence of his absence. On the surface, they maintained a semblance of normalcy. Hank was a model husband, steady, hard-working, and publicly at least deeply sympathetic to his wife's enduring sorrow. He would hold her when the anniversaries came around, TJ's birthday, the day he disappeared, and murmur comforting words about how one day their boy might come home. A grown man full of regrets and apologies. He played his part with a chilling perfection, his performance a masterpiece of deception. But beneath the surface of their low-key life, a subtle psychological terror festered. The garage, once a place of youthful energy and loud music, became Hank's forbidden sanctuary. It was always locked. He spent countless hours in there, the sounds of his work, sawing, sanding, hammering, a constant rhythmic backdrop to their silent evenings. He called it his workshop, his escape. Loretta knew it only as a place that radiated a cold, unwelcoming energy. In the first year or two after TJ disappeared, she had tried to enter the garage, hoping to find some small, forgotten memento of her son, a stray drawing, an old cassette tape. Hank's reaction had been swift and severe. "That's my space, Loretta," he had said, his voice dangerously calm. "My tools are precisely organized. I will not have you in there, disturbing things." His anger had been so disproportionate, so cold, that she had retreated, shaken. She learned over time not to ask, not to approach. The garage became a silent, locked testament to his authority, a room in her home that was not hers to enter. Her love for Hank Ward with a tiny, terrified intuition she couldn't name. It was a cognitive dissonance that slowly eroded her peace of mind. She loved the man who brought her coffee in the morning, the man who fixed the leaky faucet, the man who held her when she wept for her lost son. But she was also afraid of him. She saw the coldness that could flash in his eyes when he was challenged, the obsessive need for control in the way he organized his tools, his life, their life. And sometimes in the dead of night, she would lie awake, listening to the sounds of the old house. And she would wonder about the lie the police had, so eagerly accepted. TJ, a kid who bailed, a boy involved in drugs or gangs. It had never felt right. She would go into his untouched room, looking at the posters of Run DMC and Public Enemy, and remembered the police detective sneer when he'd seen them. This is the kind of stuff he was into, he'd asked, as if the music itself were evidence of criminality. She remembered the scrap note Hank had found. In her heart, she knew that jerky, angry scroll was not her son's. TJ's handwriting was like his art, full of flair, of loops and sharp angles. The scrap note was crude, simple, but her grief was a confusing fog, and Hank and the police had been so certain. Over time, she began to doubt her own memory, her own judgment. Perhaps she hadn't known her son as well as she thought. This self-doubt was Hank's greatest weapon, a prison for her mind, just as the garage wall was a prison for her son's body. Hank, meanwhile, nurtured her doubt. He would subtly reinforce the police's narrative. He was a good kid, but he had a temper. Loretta, he would say. You know, he did. He fell in with those kids from the city. I was just trying to protect him. He positioned himself as the stoic, misunderstood father figure who had tried and failed to save a wayward boy. He allowed her grief, but he framed it as the grief for a son who had made bad choices, not for a son who had been a victim. And so Loretta lived in a state of low-key terror, a prisoner of a mystery she could not solve. The shell of a person of her son was a constant presence, his absence of physical ache in her heart. But there was another, more insidious shell of a person in her home. The secret locked away behind the garage wall. A secret kept by the man who slept beside her every night. She was living in a trap room and didn't even know it. Her days a slow 6-year journey towards a discovery that would be more horrifying than any nightmare she could have possibly imagined. The crazy storm that hit their suburb in the late summer of 1995 was biblical. For 2 days, rain lashed down in relentless, wind-driven sheets, turning streets into rivers and overwhelming the town's aging drainage systems. On the second night of the crazy storm, Hank Porter was out of town, a rare occurrence. He was on a weekend-long carpentry job for an old client 2 counties over, a trip he couldn't postpone. Loretta was alone in the house, the noise of the thunder rattling the window panes, the flashes of lightning illuminating her small living room in stark, ghostly strobes. It was just after midnight when she heard the noise, a loud, sickening groan of stressed metal followed by a sudden rushing roar. It came from the direction of the garage. Heart pounding, she peered out the back window. The floodlight above the garage door revealed a torrent of water pouring from beneath it. A pipe had burst. Her first thought was of Hank's tools, his precious, meticulously organized workshop. He would be furious. Her second thought was one of pure, practical dread. The water was now flowing towards the house's foundation. She had to do something. Pulling on a raincoat and a pair of old boots, she grabbed a heavy flashlight and fought her way through the driving rain to the side door of the garage. It was locked as always. She fumbled with the spare key. Hank kept hidden under a loose stone, a key she hadn't touched in years. The lock was stiff, but it finally turned. She pushed the door open. The scene inside was one of out-of-control destruction. Water was inches deep across the concrete floor, swirling with sawdust and grime. Boxes had toppled, their contents spilling into the murky water, and the roar was coming from a blown pipe along the back wall, spraying a high-pressure jet of water everywhere. She found the shut-off valve, and with a great deal of effort managed to turn it, silencing the roar. The only noise now was the dripping of water and her own ragged breathing. Her flashlight beam cut through the damp, musty air playing over the scene of disarray. And as the beam traveled along the back wall, the new thick wall Hank had built 6 years ago for soundproofing, she saw something that made her freeze. The plasterboard on the lower half of the wall, soaked through by the floodwater, was soft, bulging, and in one spot had started to crumble away. Water was seeping not just onto the floor, but from behind the wall itself. Driven by a sudden, terrifying suspicion she could no longer suppress. A suspicion that had been a low-key hum in her mind for 6 long years. She approached it. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the soggy drywall. It gave way easily, crumbling in her fingers. And then the stench hit her. It was not the stench of damp plaster or rotting wood. It was a stench of deep, profound decay. A stench so horrifyingly, unmistakably organic that her stomach churned and bile rose in her throat. Her flashlight beam shaking violently. She pushed away more of the soaked drywall, revealing the dark, hollow void within. It wasn't insulation. It was a space, a dark, narrow, secret space. She shone the light inside, and it landed on a pair of wide, terrified eyes, staring back at her from the darkness. A screech tore from Loretta's throat, a noise of pure animal terror, a noise of 6 years of buried panic and intuition erupting at once. She stumbled backward, falling into the grimy water on the garage floor. Huddled in the far corner of the dark, cramped space was a figure, a young man, pale and emaciated, his hair long and matted with a rusty chain leading from his ankle to a bolt sunk deep into the concrete floor. He was a shell of a person, a figure of the dark, and he had her son's eyes. Her son, her TJ. He wasn't a kid who bailed. He hadn't left her. He had been here in this garage, a prisoner for 6 years. And the man who had comforted her, the man who had shared her bed, the man who had helped her grieve for their lost boy, had been his jailer. The sick freak wasn't a stranger. The sick freak was her husband. In that moment of horrifying discovery, her mind shattered. She scrambled back to her feet, her terror momentarily eclipsed by a fierce maternal instinct. She backed out of the garage, fumbled with her keys, locked the door, and then ran. Her legs pumping through the crazy storm to a neighbor's house. Her screams for help finally breaking along. Terrible silence of Maple Drive, the hours that followed Loretta's horrifying discovery, were a blur of flashing lights, disembodied voices, and a cold, total shutdown that enveloped her like a shroud. Her 911 call, a choked, hysterical report of finding her long-missing son alive and chained inside a wall of her own garage, had brought the full, overwhelming force of a law to her low-key suburban street in East Point, Georgia. The house, her home, was no longer her own. It was a major twisted act scene cordoned off with yellow tape, swarming with unformed officers, detectives, and forensic technicians. Detective Rennell Pierce arrived on the scene just before dawn. A sharp, observant black man in his early 40s, he had been a junior officer back in 1989 and vaguely remembered the case of the kid who bailed T.J. Grant. The official narrative had never sat right with him, but he had lacked the standing to challenge it then. Now, as the lead detective on this new horrifying discovery, he felt a grim sense of vindication and a deep, profound sorrow for the woman sitting wrapped in a blanket in the back of a patrol car, her face a mask of shattered disbelief. He spoke with Loretta gently, his voice a calm anchor in her crazy storm of trauma. She recounted the story of the blown pipe, of her forced entry into the forbidden garage, of the crumbling wall, and the nightmare it had revealed. She told him about Hank, about his obsessive control over the garage, about the wall he had built for soundproofing, and she told him about the argument on the night TJ disappeared. The forensic team, meanwhile, went to work with a grim, methodical precision. The fake wall was carefully dismantled, revealing the secret trap room within. It was a prison cell, small and crude, but chillingly effective. There was not a pad, but a crude wooden pallet, covered with old, dusty moving blankets. In the corner was a small, crudely installed drain in the concrete floor. Near the bottom of the wall was a small locked metal slot, clearly used to pass in food and water. A single low-wattage industrial bulb in a wire locked-up space hung from the ceiling. The walls were covered in thousands of desperate overlapping tally marks. A heartbreaking calendar of over 2,000 lost days. The rescued young man, now confirmed to be Trey Grant, was rushed to the hospital. He was 19 years old, but his body was frail and malnourished, his eyes blinking with terror at a world he hadn't seen in 6 years. His psychological trauma was immense. As the sun rose, casting a pale, sickly light on the scene, an alert was issued for Hank Porter. He was not a grieving husband anymore. He was a sick freak, a kidnapper, a torturer. They found him 2 hours later at a cheap motel 100 miles away, where he had been staying for his carpentry job. He didn't resist. When the officers told him why they were there, a strange, almost serene look of resignation settled on his face. The calm, respectable facade he had maintained for 6 years crumbled, revealing the cold, empty truth beneath. The interrogation of Hank Porter was short. Faced with the undeniable evidence of his living victim, he confessed. He sat in the small, sterile interview room, his hand scuffed, and recounted the events of that Friday night in 1989 with a chilling, remorseless clarity. He spoke of the argument of TJ's defiance, of the red rage that had consumed him. He admitted he had struck the boy, intending to discipline him, but had knocked him unconscious. In that moment, a new, more monstrous idea had taken root. "He shouldn't have challenged me," Hank said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Not in my own house." I decided then and there to fix the problem, to make him understand what real control was. He then described with the pride of a master craftsman how he had spent the rest of that weekend building the fake wall. He explained how he had entombed his stepson, sealed him away, and then gone upstairs to comfort his grieving wife. His twisted act, a perfect silent secret buried just yards from where she slept. For 6 years, he had been both a loving husband to her and a cruel jailer to her son. When Detective Pierce asked him about the fake kid who bailed Scrap Note, a small, cruel smirk touched Hank's lips. "That was easy," he said. "I found one of his old school notebooks from the trash, practiced his signature for about 10 minutes until it was good enough. The words, 'I just wrote what you people always want to believe.' Anyway, when Pice relayed the details of the full-on admission to Loretta, her grief was compounded by new horrifying layer of stab in the back. The man she had shared her life with, the man she had trusted, was a sick freak of unimaginable cruelty. Her low-key internal fears, the one she had dismissed as the paranoia of a grieving mother, had been a pale shadow of the horrifying reality. She had been living with her son's captor. The unmasking of Hank Porter sent a shock wave through their community. The low-key carpenter, the concerned stepfather, was revealed to be a cold-blooded sick freak. The police department of 1989 was publicly shamed for its biased, superficial investigation that had allowed this nightmare to continue for 6 long years. The story was a brutal testament to a system that had failed a black child and his mother at every turn. A failure that had only been rectified by the random, out-of-control intervention of a blown pipe in a crazy storm. The trial of Hank Porter was a swift, grim affair. Faced with his own detailed, remorseless, full-on admission and the undeniable physical evidence of the hidden cell and his living, traumatized victim, there was little his defense could do. He was found guilty of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and a litany of abuse charges, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice in the cold, efficient language of the law was served. But for Loretta Grant, the courtroom verdict was not an end, but the beginning of a different, more difficult journey. The sick freak was caged, but she was left to navigate the ruins of a life built on a foundation of monstrous lies. The man she had loved, the man she had shared a bed with, the man she had allowed to comfort her in her grief, was the very source of that grief. The stab in the back was so profound, so absolute, that it reshaped her understanding of her own past, tainting every memory of the last 6 years with a horrific, grotesque new meaning. She sold the house on Maple Drive immediately. She couldn't bear to spend another night within its walls, knowing what they had concealed. She moved to a new city, seeking the anonymity of a place where she was not that woman, the one who had lived with her son's captor. The story of T.J. Grant and his stepfather became a national sensation, a cautionary tale of domestic nightmare, a symbol of the secrets that can fester behind the closed doors of a seemingly normal suburban home. For a time, Loretta was sounded by reporters, by television producers, by people who wanted to package her pain into a true twisted act special. She refused them all. Her story was not entertainment. It was a childhood lived and lost. The years that followed were a low-key, arduous process of rebuilding. Loretta focused entirely on TJ's recovery, a journey that felt at times impossible. TJ, now a young man of 19, had to relearn the world. He was terrified of open spaces, of loud noises of other people. He suffered from severe post-traumatic stress. His mind, a fractured landscape of panic and confusion. He had spent his entire adolescence in a dark room. The world of 1995 was an overwhelming, incomprehensible assault on his senses. Loretta became his fierce, unwavering protector, his guide back to a world that was alien to him. She sat with him through years of intensive therapy. She patiently taught him things a mother should never have to teach her grown son: how to order food in a restaurant, how to use a telephone, how to simply walk down a street without being consumed by panic. The brilliant, energetic boy who loved hip-hop and art was gone, replaced by a low-key, frightened man who was a stranger to his own life. The story ends years later. Loretta is now a grandmother. She has a new family, a reset, but the scar on her soul is permanent. She is in the backyard of her own small, sunny home, a place she is filled with light and laughter. She is watching her grandchildren play. Their joyful shouts a stark contrast to the long silence that once defined her life. She is not healed in a simple way that stories often promise. The shell of a person of TJ, her bright, energetic boy, is always with her. But as she watches her grandchildren, she feels not just the ache of his absence, but the enduring strength of his memory. She survived. Her family survived. And in that survival, there's a low-key, powerful victory. She has learned that the most important walls are not the ones made of plaster and wood, but the ones we build around our own hearts. And that the most courageous act of all is not just tearing down the walls that imprison us, but having the strength to build new ones that let the light in. The nightmare of her past is a part of her story, but it is not the end of it. The end is this. A low-key afternoon, a sunny backyard, the noise of children's laughter, and a peace that is not perfect, but is against all odds real.